Hello everyone, my name is Tory and welcome to the ScruTone Podcast. In today's episode, I would like to introduce our guest, Dr. Matt Beech, and he is currently the director of the Centre for British Politics, and he works also as a reader in politics, and he is also the senior fellow at UC Berkeley's Institute of European Studies. Welcome to Budapest, Matt. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I think you just said that this is your second time here in Budapest, and we are very happy that we can have a conversation with you here at ScruTone Podcast. So first of all, as we are sitting here at the ScruTone Cafe, my first question would be, how did you get familiar with ScruTone's work? Because you mentioned to us that you are kind of a ScruTone scholar. So my question would be, how did ScruTone's heritage, his philosophical world, influence your work?
Well, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And yes, this is my second time in Budapest. I probably wouldn't describe myself so much as a scholar, but I'm certainly someone who is a learner of the thought and the writing of Roger ScruTone. I came to ScruTone perhaps later in my career. I was trained by a Hegelian philosopher, a wonderful man and a really important thinker called Raymond Plant, who I studied with at the University of Southampton, where I did my doctorate. Plant is a Labour member of the House of Lords, a former professor at Southampton, a master at an Oxford College. And so I studied under him, and I studied under him about British socialist thought. And I was introduced, despite the fact he's a Hegelian, I was also introduced to analytic Anglo-American thinking, Anglo-American political philosophy, chiefly John Rawls, but Robert Nozick and others. And I taught them for a little while in my early part of my career. And I came to, through a couple of different colleagues of mine who were engaging with the work of Roger ScruTone, I started to read his work. Mainly his work on politics, although his work on aesthetics and art and architecture and wine and hunting is interesting, I guess, in and of itself. But for me, it was his understanding and interpreting of the conservative tradition that I found useful. And I found it useful, I think, at a time in my life when I was perhaps re-evaluating who I should vote for and how I would vote. I'd always been a small c conservative, but I'd been a small c conservative who'd voted Labour and who'd voted Conservative, and I was a small c conservative when I was studying under Lord Plant. And so one of the things that really, I guess, had an impact on me was the attitudes towards the European Union, British membership of the European Union. And again, I went from someone who was very supportive of British membership of the European Union to someone who became a European Union sceptic for Britain. And I think also that was around the time that I was reading and also watching the lectures and the interviews of Sir Roger ScruTone that are available online.
Thank you. So just before we move into our topic about British politics, who do you recommend in Hungary, especially the books of Roger ScruTone? Would you like to recommend it to the younger generation?
Yes, I think his work on conservatism and political philosophy and the meaning of conservatism, I think they are the books that give one a grounding in the tradition of thought of a conservative, limited, sceptical, anti-utopian understanding of politics And so I think those works, The Meaning of Conservatism, and then the book that was published much later around, I think 2016, which was a collection of his essays, Conservatism and Political Philosophy. I think those books are really accessible, and I think one of his great strengths was that he wrote in an engaging manner. And I think that if students in Hungary or elsewhere were wanting to engage with his work, I think that would be quite a good place to start.
Thank you. Okay, so today's topic would be mostly the British politics. We would like to ask you to give a brief insight about the British political life, how it has been changed in the last few years, and focusing after the Brexit in 2020. What were the major changes, issues, and impacts which could influence the upcoming elections on the 4th of July?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's quite a complex question. So I think very soon after the Johnson government signed the EU exit bill in 2020, January 2020, only a few weeks later, COVID hit us, hit Europe, hit the world. And so then we had lockdowns, we had significant restriction on basic liberties. We were all quite worried about the pandemic. We obviously the vaccine was being rushed through and tried to make it available for those who were vulnerable, those who wanted to take it. But during that time, Boris Johnson got in all sorts of problems, as did our current Prime Minister, who was his then Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, about breaking their own regulations in this Coronavirus Act. And that set off a chain of events, really, that led to his resignation. And so the Conservative Party lost its Prime Minister, lost a vote winner who'd won an 80-seat majority in December 2019, not that long ago, only 4.5 years ago. And I think it was, you could say that, Johnson had form. He was always a controversial figure. He was always someone who was very close to controversy within his own party, and obviously with the left, with the Labour Party and the progressive movement in general. But I think that sort of rule breaking really cut through into the media, cut through into the public. And it built this momentum, and he had to go. So when the Conservative Party lost its Prime Minister, lost the leader who, in effect, delivered the 80-seat majority and got Brexit done, then that has completely changed the political environment. And because of that, we then had the Conservative Party then voted in Liz Truss, and she was Prime Minister for about 40-odd days. Had a not very successful budget, that's perhaps an understatement. Kwasi Kwarteng, her Chancellor, and her, a real kind of bold, is one way of putting it, budget put on, and the markets reacted strongly against it. Markets don't like uncertainty, the financial markets I'm talking about in particular. And there was great concerns about mortgages and rates and everything. And so she went, and so the Conservative Party then chose Rishi Sunak, who had not won in the recent leadership election because the party members had voted for Liz Truss. So, in a way, Johnson's personality and behaviour as Prime Minister during COVID became a path-dependent series of events, and that's where we are, and we're 14 years of one party. All right, we've had a number of leaders. We've had a Conservative Prime Minister in David Cameron, Theresa May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak. So the British people have had the Tory party, they've had the Blue Rosette, they've had lots of different leaders who, some are pro-British membership of the EU, some are sceptical and wanted Brexit, some are more socially liberal, some are a wee bit more socially conservative, not very conservative, because there are very, very few conservatives in the British Conservative Party. I think one of the biggest challenges, really, if I'm being honest with you, is that the Conservative Parliamentary Party probably has a handful of people, maybe 10, and who knows how many at the next general election, because they don't look like they're going to do very well. They look like they're going to be on the end of a very strong beating by the Labour Party. But I think the real problem is that philosophically there are not many, I would call small c conservatives or orthodox conservatives. There are lots of market liberals, there are a handful of libertarians, there are quite a lot of progressives who just see the Tory party as the best pragmatic option for being in Parliament. But people who would actually be conservative, people who would actually, for example, could engage with the work of ScruTone or other people, or see themselves in a wider, longer tradition, like Burke, but all the way through the 19th century, sort of like a Disraelian tradition, a Stanley Baldwin tradition that started the 20th century, mid-20th century, it could be a variety of different people. You could look at Helsham, you could look at others, and then the likes of Roger. There are not that many. They're really, to be honest, the Conservative Party is a market liberal party with a large degree of social liberals, a handful of libertarians, and a smattering of conservatives. And yet there are many, many conservative members, or not members, there are many conservative voters who vote Tory. There are many socially conservative, patriotic, traditional Labourites, Labour-inclined voters who at the last election under Johnson, because they wanted Britain to leave the EU, and they wanted tighter regs on immigration, and they wanted much less, they liked his kind of politically incorrect style. They wanted that kind of agenda, but that kind of red wall that the Tories won in 2019 looks like it's going to be completely reclaimed by Keir Starmer and his thoroughly progressive Labour Party.
So we can hear this from a lot of political experts that the Tory party is expected to fall out of power.
Yep.
And so, as what you just previously said, are you agree with it? And if yes, do you believe in a kind of a renaissance in the conservatism in the UK? So do you think that would be a solution, like a renewal of the party? And how is it possible? Which way? What could be the solution?
So if you believe all the polling, and I don't think there's a reason not to believe it, because so many different polling companies who have different methodologies have been asking lots of people for a jolly long time now about their intentions and how they're voting, and the Labour Party has a very large lead. You've always got to consider the X factor in politics, like some great scandal could happen in the next few weeks, that might change some voters, or the rise of Reform and Nigel Farage. I mean, I think that's another thing that's going to damage the Conservatives. It's not just that Keir Starmer seems pretty sensible on foreign and defence policy. He's he's isolated the hard left of his party, and Labour's been out of power 14 years, so in some sense the political pendulum has to swing back at some stage. We don't have one party state, and nor should we want that. But not just that, but I also think, I think that's a necessary condition, but it's not perhaps a sufficient condition. I think a sufficient condition for the Tories being absolutely wiped out and Labour potentially having a landslide is that quite a lot of Conservative voters are going to vote for the Reform Party, or some of them are just going to stay at home and sit on their hands. But I think if you look at the polling at the moment, Reform's doing very well. So I think, yes, it would seem that Labour are going to win the election. They're going to win by a very, very large amount. And there's going to be a day of reckoning for the Conservatives. Now, to answer the second part of your question about could there be a renaissance or a reformation or a great kind of change, well, I think there'll have to be. I think there'll have to be, because the Conservative Party are internally divided, they're fatigued, and they are facing a significant political movement on their right flank. And so we'll have to see how many voters vote for reform. They might not get very many parliamentary seats because of the nature of the first past post electoral system, but we'll have to just see how many votes they get. And then we'll have to see what the likes of Nigel Farage choose to do after the election, and whether he opens his arms wide and says to people who are Tory voters or Tory MPs, come and join Reform, or whether He says, no, actually, the Conservative Party's reputation, history and brand is so established, even though it's not very well regarded at the moment. Reform, who knows, Farage and Reform might enter into the Conservative Party. We don't know, and actually be like a faction within that. We don't know. It's going to be a fascinating election, to be honest.
Yeah, it's very exciting. So my next question would be about the Labour Party. Do you think that there will be a big change in the UK society if the Labour Party will be stronger? And do you think that the strength of the Labour Party could have a bigger influence on the ideological perspective of the society, moving more to the left?
Yes, I think
in general.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. It will be the case. The size of the majority will determine the extent to which Sir Keir Starmer can pass a radical set of bills, a radical set of legislation, and I think that would be in the areas of the Constitution, closer relationships with the European Union, probably a greater raft of social rights, a greater kind of role for judges to then determine whether people's rights have been usurped or not. And so I think we could have a constitutional and kind of, to some extent, significant constitutional change, but not necessarily just constitutional change in terms of the House of Lords or the electoral system or devolution or decentralisation. I also mean constitutional change that could potentially instantiate a new set of rights for citizens that the British people haven't asked for, by the way, and by so doing put the power to guard those rights in the hands of judges, so juridification of British politics as opposed to Parliament. And the reason why they might want to do that, it would be harder then for a Conservative government to unpick that. It wouldn't be impossible, because no Parliament can bind its successor, and you have a majority, you could get your bill in Parliament through, and you could unpick that. But it would be more difficult, because once you establish greater rights or a new institution, people get used to them, even though they might grumble about it. They get used to it, and they become reluctant to have those rights or those extra privileges removed. Well, one example would be this. For quite a long time in Wales, after devolution, a majority of the Welsh people were a bit hesitant about devolution. But it was kind of almost unthinkable that you could take that back and take back what has now become what was an assembly with limited powers, and it was an assembly with greater powers on a range of issues. Now is a Senedd, in effect a parliament. To take that away, I mean, I think that would be difficult, even though there are many problems with how Labour have run politics in Wales, and even more so how the SNP, who've been in power since 2007, have run Scotland into the ground economically, in terms of the healthcare system, in terms of the education system, and the mire of scandal that Nicola Sturgeon and her husband are in as well. So, but it's just unthinkable that you could roll that back. I think that you could sort of like take that back, even if you thought that would be better, to strengthen Parliament, to say there's one Parliament for all of Great Britain, those three nations. Northern Ireland's different, and given the Belfast Agreement, and obviously it had antecedents actually way before the Troubles in terms of its own legislature. But I think if Keir Starmer does win a big majority, one of the things we might see is newer economic and social rights instantiated in law, refereed by judges. And I think that would be more difficult for an incoming Conservative government, who might think these aren't in the interest of everyone, they're not in the interest maybe of our nation. But in fairness, if Keir Starmer does win a large majority, he has every right to get his bills through Parliament. And if that's what the British people want, that's what they will get. And the opposition must be heard in Parliament, but the government must get their agenda through, must get their bills through.
As we are sitting here at ScruTone Cafe and we are supporting the work and the philosophical heritage of Roger Scruton, let's talk a bit about conservatism, and let's talk about free speech. As free speech, as far as I know, is one of your main topic nowadays.
Right.
So could you please give us a brief insight how traditions, Christian beliefs, Judeo-Christian heritage, and these kind of topics are judged right now in the British society, and if there should be a change about that, politically. What's your opinion about that?
Well, my opinion is that free speech on university campuses is not in great shape. Free speech in wider civil society is not in great shape. What I mean by free speech is free speech under the law. I don't think we need any new laws in the UK. I think we have plenty of liberty under the law. Be that, let's think of the Education No. 2 Act 1986 in terms of campus speech, the very recently passed Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023, let alone the Human Rights Act 1998 and the Equality Act 2010. I think we have plenty of rights. But so you might say, well, then if you think there's plenty of rights and plenty of legal protection, what's all this fuss about? Are you not just one of these stuffy old conservatives who's... Well, no, but the issue is that it's one thing to have legal protections. It's another thing for those rights or those traditions. The word rights, I think, the privilege, we've had these privileges of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. That's about freedom of expression. We've had these for way in our past. But the difficulty is that in civil society groups right across our country, and I think this is the case in much of Europe as well, they're not respected. So it's one thing to say, well, we have legal privilege to say what we think about gender, sex, sexuality, or to criticise, for example, a particular political ideology, or to criticise a particular economic doctrine, or what have you. But it's another thing altogether is if your workplace says, actually, you need to... Someone in your workplace might say to you, this is not going to be very good for your career if you keep saying these things in meetings or in class, if you're an academic, or you post things that are entirely legal and temperate online. You could get passed over for a promotion, what have you. The other thing that I think is really interesting, quite a lot of companies have this statement, not in line with our values. So they might say, oh no, we're progressive and we're open-minded and we want diversity, but they often, increasingly in the culture we live in, they don't much want diversity of opinion or diversity of moral belief. So if you're a Christian, or if you're a traditional committed Jew, or a conservative Muslim, and you speak out about your views, let's say about gender theory, and you say you don't, for example, think that men are men and women are women, and that's it. That's deeply controversial, and you might come up against this kind of rather sort of ominous phrase of, well, actually, I'm sorry, your views are not in line with our values. Well, the law protects one's right to have religion and belief, to have philosophical belief and to have religious opinion. Now, providing people are saying that within the bounds of the law, and that's what I started with, liberty of speech and expression within the bounds of the law, then that's entirely legal. And providing you put it in a temperate way that's not threatening anybody and is not abusing anyone, and most people don't seek to abuse people or threaten people, they just want to be able to have their say in terms of a free exchange of ideas as a community of equal citizens, then I think that's reasonable. But my concern I have really is not at the level of the state. I think we have sufficient liberties of expression and speech under the law. My concern is that civil society groups, companies, workplaces, whether that's private sector, especially in the public sector, where you've had quite a lot more woke stuff, but you've had lots of woke policies by big corporations, particularly big corporations that have tended to emanate from certain parts of the United States, but also perhaps in social groups, in organisations, even in certain religious groups. I mean, I know that for myself, that they're starting to say, well, you know, we have to change what we think about this, and then if you have someone that has a robust or dissenting view, they're kind of viewed as being kind of intemperate or intolerant or backward or a dinosaur. The problem is that there's one rule for one and one rule for the other. And I honestly think that we absolutely need temperate language. We don't need to be screaming at each other online and posting anonymous things. And there's so much dreadful stuff that happens online that passes for free speech. And so some on the left say, well, the right just use free speech as almost like a defence to say the indefensible. And I guess at some stage that's true in some instances, and people shouldn't be doing that. But simultaneously, people should be able to disagree. They should be able to say, no, I completely disagree with what you say. I disagree with how you're behaving. And I'm not expecting for me to change your mind, but I'm just saying it, and I have every liberty to say that. And I think that that's really important. And I think it's important for conservatives to model that as well. So it's all well and good if we can all say, well, that's just intolerant, that's the liberalism of contemporary progressivism, that's woke nonsense. We can all point these things out that are outside of common sense, outside of scientific reality, outside of our intellectual heritage. That's very easy. That's low-hanging fruit. What we have to also do is to sort of police our own backyard. So if some of our friends or people that we like, who are intellectuals and journalists, if they are becoming a little bit intolerant of different perspectives, then we have to say, look, if we want that to be the standard by which intellectuals and academics and journalists and artists and politicians and citizens exchange and have debates with each other, we have to model that as well. And I think, I'll give you a really good example. In the 1960s, it was the student left and kind of like John F. Kennedy liberals who absolutely had the right argument, particularly when they were speaking out at UC Berkeley, where I have a research position, but other campuses in the United States, against conservative university leaders, conservative politicians, about the right to have free speech, to proselytise for their own candidates. That's right and proper. And now, those professors, and they're often quite old now, who were the student radicals of the 60s, they need to be as passionate and full-throated in the defence of conservatives and classical liberals and libertarians who are saying, we want to have that same spirit of plurality and openness on our campuses today, and what we would expect from you is the same measure of generosity. So the problem is that often we're not generous with each other, and that's because these are passionate issues which we care about. So what we try and do, and what I try and do in my Culture Wars module at Hull University that I've been teaching for the last 7 years, students know what my views are. I have pretty clear views, and sometimes they take the module because they know what my views are. But they can critique me, they can criticise me, and I want that. But also then they have to listen to the other students in the room who might have a different view to them. So if we're going to learn anything meaningfully, we have to not only have the freedom to read the controversial thinkers, ask the controversial questions, but we have to give our interlocutor the dignity to actually say their bit. And it's never perfect, and we all get it wrong from time to time, but we have to actually model that in our own conversations.
As we are moving forward, it just came to my mind that I would like to ask you, like we were previously we talked something about the younger generations, like the differences between older and younger generations. And I would like to ask how is the situation with the young people and especially young generation in Britain? Yeah. Are they apolitical, or how much are they involved into politics? Do you think that they are interested, or what do you think about that?
In general elections, generally speaking, it's hard for the political parties to get a significant majority of under 30s or under 35s to vote regularly. It just has. Young people are doing different things in their lives. But that does not mean to say that young people in Britain today, and when I mean young people, I might take people for 30 and younger, let's say for argument's sake, it doesn't mean to say that that generation doesn't care about issues. They care about lots of political and social issues. They care very deeply about them. So that's how I'd answer that question. I'd also say there is a tension between the generations. And I think there's a tension not just in Britain. I think right across the Western world there is a tension between generations. I think partly that's economic, because increasingly, certainly in Britain, but right across the developed West, the price of flats and apartments and houses, especially in our big cities, has gone up and up and up. And the beginning of property ownership, the beginning of getting your foot on the property ladder is becoming just a pipe dream for many people who are 30, 35 years old. And that's a real problem. So that builds resentment. That's the first thing I think I need to say. So it doesn't matter if wages are going up, and wages have been going up quite a bit in Britain. Wage inflation's been going up, and prices have been going down. So you might think, well, that's good, isn't it? Well, it is in one sense. But if property prices are going up, if there's inflation, then that's a real problem. So then a lot of young people don't feel they have a stake in the system. So in a way, that is almost stretching out youth, elongating youth. And that actually is not good if you're a conservative, because you want to encourage people to move on to the next stage of life, get married, have a family, own property, set up a business, flourish in their professional lives, so they become the leaders of tomorrow. So I think we're not doing a very good job on one level, at a structural economic level of that, and that's a problem, because people older than me, but my generation, but particularly people older than me, have bought up lots of extra houses in these cities, and they've been using that as a pension kind of pot. And there's also been, significant immigration, lots of international students. So universities build, particularly in certain cities, buy up lots of low-cost housing, or maybe build very fancy tower blocks on what was an area of low-cost housing. And that appeals to international students who want luxury accommodation, who pay high fees. So in one sense, you could say, well, that's good for the economy because the universities contribute to the economy. That's very true. But the downside is that land is finite. There's not an unlimited supply of it. And everyone has to live somewhere. And so we need to get to the point where we're building more affordable, significantly affordable houses and flats for people who are sort of like 25, 30, 35. So I think if that economic readjustment occurs, and it won't occur overnight, it'll take a while, I think that could in some sense reduce some of the tension that there is. The other thing about it is we still don't fully know the impact of the smartphone and the impact of social media upon this generation. So it's my generation, people in their 40s, who created the likes of Facebook and things like that, and many other these social media platforms and what have you. But it's this generation, Gen Z, and perhaps even younger. We haven't yet mapped and measured the psychological and the social impact and, I think, cost of a very different experience of growing up growing up, and not just constantly staring at a phone, but growing up with virtual relationships rather than often real relationships, growing up with people liking photographs of, constantly judging how people look. So to be honest, we're in an era of quite significant technological change. It's not a new thing to say, and we haven't actually been able to grasp the impact on younger people. And so I think in a way it's really challenging for people who are, say, 35, 30 years old, actually.
Yeah, I agree. So just closing down our conversation, my last question would be talk a bit about the general challenges which are in front of the Conservative Party, like in Europe in general, and a bit focusing on Britain. So what's next? Like my question would be, what's next?
Yeah.
Because the elections will happen on the 4th of July in the UK.
Yeah.
So just closing down our conversations, we could talk about your forecast, like your personal opinion. What do you expect? What will happen on the 4th of July? And what will be the most important issues and challenges?
Sure. Well, my students
in the future.
My students and my colleagues will tell you that I'm very, very bad at forecasting. I shouldn't do it because I get nearly every major call wrong. I was wrong about the presidential election in 2016. I was wrong about the British EU referendum, and so I'm not very good. I think probably, as it looks like it, Labour will win big on the 4th of July, which will lead to a significant period of reflection from the Conservative Party. And as I alluded to earlier, I think it also does depend to some extent on to what extent Reform have captured a lot of votes, maybe not seats, maybe some seats, but maybe not a lot of seats, more votes. And then what Nigel Farage and the others in that party choose to do in terms of reforming the centre-right, reforming the right. I think if you're looking wider across Europe and for conservatism in Europe, I think at the level of culture and perhaps, for example, the level of speech as we've been talking about within civil society and the liberty of that culture, I think conservatives need to start building a very strong analytical narrative that sets out exactly why they are hostile to certain radical and utopian ideologies, critical social justice, critical race theory, critical legal theory, in different forms of what I would understand to be perhaps the Western turn in post-war Marxism, which have filtered right across the social sciences and humanities and universities, but have informed progressive centre-left and, I think, centre-right parties. So I think there's some intellectual work to do at the level of culture and ideas, and I think we can come together as conservatives in Europe and talk about those things. What I think is very difficult to do is to look at the very varied economic, foreign policy, constitutional settings that different European countries are in and that different conservatives in different European countries face and say, hey, there's a manifesto for us. I don't think you can do that because I think the contingent histories of different countries and therefore their political parties mean that you've got different legal systems, different constitutional setups, different electoral systems. And so often in some countries, the Conservatives are in coalition with all sorts of partners that in, say, for example, in a country like Britain, they wouldn't be working with at all, not currently. So I think you can talk a lot at the level of culture and ideas and particularly to try and highlight common adversaries and things with, ideas and traditions that are doing great damage, and try to come up with ways in which we can find the right grammar and articulate an analytical narrative to kind of perhaps push back a little bit but push back in a way that whilst is robust, it still dignifies our political opponent, because, and this is what I'd like to finish on, our political opponents are also our fellow citizens. They're also our neighbours. Okay, and I think the fundamental edict to love thy neighbour is really what, one of the great truths of Western civilization. And I think conservatives should realise that there is much that unites us to one another. And I think Roger Scruton was very strong on the notion of nation, home, place, and from that you get a strong sense of neighbourliness. So we should go out there, we should have robust arguments with our friends and our neighbours about politics and about parties and what have you, but we should never forget that ultimately we share a space, we share a neighbourhood, we share a nation, we share a language. We seek to love our neighbour in that sense. And I think that if conservatives can do that, if proper orthodox conservatives, small c conservatives can do that, then I think that's not a bad thing.
So thank you so much, Dr. Beech, for being here with us. Thank you for the exciting conversation. Thank you all the listeners for being here with us, and we will come with new exciting conversations soon.